In a neighborhood where conformity was law and perfection was only skin deep, one man's dream of freedom rolled in on four wheels and parked itself in the driveway. What
Oh my
began
gosh,
as a
I can't
harmless
believe she
RV
did
purchase
that.
quickly
I
spiraled
know,
into
right?
a war of pettiness, power, and pride. With a single neighbor determined to destroy him at any cost, the Araval quiet suburban neighborhood was known for
I
its
can park
manicured
my RV
lawns,
on my property,
beige-colored
Karen.
homes, and carefully curated appearances. Residents prided themselves on order, conformity, and the illusion of perfect harmony. It was the kind of place where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen, at least, until the day a large, gleaming RV rolled into the driveway of one particular homeowner. The man who owned it was proud of his new purchase. He had worked years to save up for the motor home, envisioning road trips, family vacations, and weekends spent exploring the open highways. For him, it was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of freedom, of escape from the rigid patterns of suburban life. But in a neighborhood like his, where conformity was the unwritten rule, freedom was often seen as defiance. His arrival with the RV did not go unnoticed. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, neighbors peered out with suspicion, whispering amongst themselves. And at the center of it all was one woman who thrived on control, the infamous Karen of the street. She was not only a nosy neighbor, but also an unofficial enforcer of the Homeowners Association's most trivial rules. Armed with a sense of entitlement and a clipboard of violations, Karen prided herself on making sure everyone else lived exactly as she saw fit. To Karen, the RV was not a vehicle. It was an eyesore, an insult, and a direct challenge to the order she believed she maintained. From the moment she laid eyes on it, she began her campaign. She took photographs from multiple angles, emailed the HOA board, and even slipped letters into his mailbox. Her complaints were swift and relentless. She insisted that the RV violated the community's covenants and demanded its immediate removal. The man, however, knew his rights. The HOA bylaws, which he had read thoroughly, stated that vehicles must not obstruct traffic or be left in common areas. But his RV was parked neatly in his own driveway. It was registered, insured, and fully within the limits of his property. But Karen didn't care about what was legal. She cared about what she wanted as soon. Official-looking letters began arriving. The HOA cited vague aesthetic concerns and threatened daily fines if the RV remained. They labeled it a nuisance and even claimed it lowered the value of nearby homes. None of these accusations were backed by specific rules, yet the threats continued for weeks. The man tried to ignore it. He went about his life, planning weekend trips, cleaning the RV, and making sure it remained spotless. But Karen escalated her efforts. She called tow companies, though none would act without a valid violation. She stood on the sidewalk, with her arms crossed, glaring at him whenever he stepped outside. She even went door to door, gathering signatures for a petition demanding the RV be removed. At first, some neighbors sympathized with her. They were tired of her constant meddling, but feared her wrath if they didn't support her. Others quietly resented her power but stayed silent, not wanting to draw attention to themselves. The man, however, refused to back down. This was his property, his driveway, and his legal right to park his RV. But Karen's persistence soon made the situation unbearable. Every time he returned from work, he found fresh notes taped to his door. Every time he mowed his lawn, she appeared outside, muttering under her breath about community standards. The tension grew heavier with each passing day until the man decided he would no longer play defense. If Karen wanted a battle, he was prepared to give her one, but on his terms. He began researching the exact wording of the HOA bylaws. He documented every letter, every interaction, and every baseless complaint. He gathered copies of state laws regarding property rights and vehicle regulations. He even consulted with an attorney, just in case the HOA tried to push further. By the time he was finished, he wasn't just prepared, he was armed with knowledge. And knowledge in these battles was the sharpest weapon. And then he came up with an idea, a bold, calculated move that would make a statement no one could ignore. If Karen hated the RV in his driveway so much, what would she do if it was somewhere even closer to her? Somewhere that would force her to look at it every single day. From the moment she opened her curtains to the moment she stepped outside. The plan was both simple and brilliant. The property lines between their homes had a narrow strip of land, technically his, running alongside Karen's driveway. It was seldom used, mostly just a patch of grass separating their two driveways, but it was just wide enough for the RV to fit. He cleared the strip, measured carefully, and repositioned the RV, slowly, deliberately. He guided the massive vehicle until it sat perfectly aligned just inches from Karen's driveway. Now, every time she pulled in or out, she would be greeted by the towering presence of the RV she despised. The effect was immediate. Karen stormed outside, furious, her face turning red as she realized what had happened. She waved her arms, shouted into the air, and marched back inside to make another round of phone calls. But this time, the man was ready. Every complaint she filed, every accusation she made, fell flat against the undeniable truth. The RV was legally parked on his property, and in full compliance with all rules. The neighborhood erupted with whispers and laughter. Some residents secretly applauded him for finally standing up to Karen. Others watched in fascination, eager to see what would happen next. For the first time in years, someone had turned the tables on the woman who had tormented the community for so long. And as Karen seethed, glaring at the RV towering over her driveway, the man knew this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over, but the message had been sent loud and clear. He would not be intimidated, and he would not back down. The stage was set for a war of persistence, pride, and pettiness that would soon engulf the entire neighborhood. Retaliation. Karen was not the type to accept defeat. Watching the massive RV loom over her driveway was more than she could tolerate. Every morning when she stepped outside, the reflection of sunlight bouncing off its polished surface mocked her. Every evening when she pulled her car into her driveway, the vehicle cast a long shadow across her property, reminding her that she had lost the first round. For a woman like Karen, that was unacceptable. Within days, her retaliation began. She started by filing new complaints with the HOA, each one more desperate than the last. She claimed the RV blocked her view, reduced visibility for drivers, and created a safety hazard. She argued that the sheer size of the vehicle intimidated neighbors and diminished property values. Though none of these claims were supported by actual rules, Karen submitted them relentlessly, hoping quantity would win where quality had failed. The HOA board, weary of her constant barrage, reluctantly scheduled a special review of the RV situation. Karen attended the meeting armed with binders of photographs and highlighted sections of the bylaws taken out of context, of course. She argued with passion, insisting that if the board didn't take action, the entire neighborhood would descend into chaos. Yet when the board asked her to provide the specific covenant the RV violated, she faltered. The man had followed every rule to the letter, and the bylaws had no restrictions against vehicles parked on private driveways. Frustrated, Karen shifted tactics. If the HOA wouldn't enforce her demands, she would escalate matters on her own. She began approaching other neighbors, spreading rumors about the RV owner. She claimed he was bringing down the neighborhood and accused him of being selfish and inconsiderate. She painted a picture of a man who cared nothing for the community, only for himself. But not everyone believed her. Many neighbors, quietly tired of Karen's antics, began to sympathize with the man instead. The tension soon spilled over into daily life. Karen started standing outside whenever the man was working on his RV, snapping photographs with exaggerated gestures as if documenting a crime scene. She called city inspectors, who arrived, checked the RV, and quickly left after finding no violations. She even tried calling the police, only to be reminded that parking on one's own property was not a criminal offense. Each failed attempt only deepened her frustration. But Karen was clever in her own way. If she couldn't win through rules or legalities, she would try to make life so miserable that her neighbor would give up voluntarily. She began parking her own car as close to the RV as possible, squeezing the space to make maneuvering difficult. She turned her sprinklers on at odd hours, soaking the side of the RV. She even placed trash bins dangerously close, accidentally scraping them against the paint when dragging them out for collection. At first, the man stayed patient. He documented everything, photographing each incident and noting the dates. He knew that direct confrontation would only escalate the feud, and he wanted evidence on his side should things ever move into legal territory. But patience has its limits, and Karen's persistence was starting to wear thin. Then came the letter that changed everything. The HOA, under mounting pressure from Karen, issued an official notice demanding the RV be removed pending further review. They cited neighborhood harmony and visual consistency, vague phrases that carried no real legal weight but sounded authoritative. The man read the letter, his frustration boiling over. He knew the board wasn't acting on rules. They were bending under the weight of Karen's constant pressure. This was no longer just about an RV. It was about principle, about whether a homeowner had the right to enjoy his property without being harassed. And he was determined to make sure Karen, the HOA, and everyone else watching understood that he would not bow to intimidation. That night, as he stood beside his RV, he began to plan his next move. He knew Karen thrived on control and attention. She wanted him to feel powerless, cornered, and isolated. The best way to fight back wasn't just to resist, it was to turn her tactics against her. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A local gardening competition was announced in the nearby town, inviting homeowners to showcase their yards. While Karen scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as beneath her, the man saw something greater. His property, though modest, had plenty of potential. If he could transform it into something extraordinary, not only would it strengthen his reputation, but it would also put Karen's complaints into perspective. Who could argue about an RV being an eyesore when the rest of the property stood out as a model of beauty and care? Over the following weeks, he poured energy into his garden. He planted rows of vibrant flowers, installed stone walkways, and added decorative lighting that illuminated the yard at night. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to notice. Some even offered to help, dropping by with extra seeds, lending tools, or simply expressing their support. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Where Karen had once dominated with fear and complaints, the man's determination began inspiring others. Karen, of course, was furious. She sneered at the flowers, mocked the decorations, and claimed the garden was tacky. But behind her bitterness was a growing sense of panic. The more beautiful the yard became, the weaker her argument about the RV looked. She tried harder, escalating her tactics. She filed noise complaints about lawn equipment, accused him of attracting pests with mulch, and even suggested the lights were too bright for the community. Yet every complaint was countered with calm, precise evidence. Every accusation fell flat, and as the garden flourished, so too did the man's resolve. The RV still stood proudly beside Karen's driveway, unmovable and unyielding. But now, it was no longer the centerpiece of the conflict. It was part of a larger symbol, a symbol of defiance, of resilience, and of a homeowner who refused to be bullied. Karen could feel the tide turning against her. Where once she had commanded authority, she now looked like the villain in her own story. And though she didn't know it yet, the next chapter of this feud would bring consequences she never expected. Consequences that would play out in front of the entire neighborhood. Sabotage. Karen's frustration had reached a breaking point. The RV stood firm, parked defiantly beside her driveway, while the once ordinary yard next door had blossomed into something remarkable. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact with each other now paused to admire the vibrant flowers, the well-laid pots, and the glowing lights that transformed the garden each evening. Some even referred to it as the highlight of the street. And that was the part Karen hated most. She could no longer spin her story of the inconsiderate RV owner ruining the neighborhood when the evidence in front of everyone said otherwise. His property looked like a magazine cover, while hers remained plain and uninspired. The community's support was shifting, and with it, Karen's grip on power was slipping. When her complaints to the HOA began falling on deaf ears, she resorted to a darker path. If she couldn't win by rules or persuasion, she would sabotage. It started subtly. One morning, the man awoke to find a row of newly planted flowers crushed, as if someone had stomped through them. In the night, at first, he thought it was an animal, but the neatly broken stems and deliberate path told a different story. He documented it with photos, quietly adding them to his growing collection of evidence. Days later, mulch piles he had carefully laid were mysteriously scattered across the driveway. Decorative lights he had installed were yanked from the soil, their wires snapped, Even the RV wasn't spared. Small scratches appeared along its side, the kind that came from sharp objects deliberately dragged across the paint. The man kept his composure. He had expected Karen to escalate, and now she was showing her true colors. Every act of sabotage strengthened his case. Still, it was disheartening to see his hard work constantly undone. The garden was supposed to be his sanctuary, his statement of peace and beauty against her bitterness. Now, it had become a battlefield. Neighbors noticed too. Some whispered about Karen's late-night movements, about how her porch light flicked on at strange hours, about how she lingered near his property line more often than usual. Suspicion spread, and while no one openly accused her, the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. But Karen underestimated her neighbor's resolve. She thought destruction would break him, that he would grow tired and eventually surrender. Instead, he doubled down. He reinforced the garden, installed sturdier lights, and invested in security cameras, small, discreet devices positioned to capture every corner of his property. The first few nights after installing the cameras were quiet. Karen must have sensed something was different, or perhaps she was planning her next move carefully. But eventually, her anger got the better of her. It was just after midnight when she crept across the strip of grass that separated their driveways. Clad in dark clothing and clutching a pair of gardening shears, she moved quickly but not carefully enough. The cameras caught everything: the deliberate snip of flower stems, the harsh scraping of metal against the RV's side, the smug expression on her face as she looked back at her handiwork. By morning, the man had the footage downloaded, backed up, and saved in multiple places. He said nothing at first, allowing the situation to play out naturally. As expected, Karen emerged later that day, feigning innocence, loudly commenting to another neighbor about how unfortunate it was that the flowers seemed damaged again. But this time, her performance fooled no one. Word spread quickly. Though the man hadn't yet shown the footage, whispers of cameras went around the block. Neighbors began watching her more closely, exchanging knowing glances whenever she stormed outside. Karen's credibility, once her greatest weapon, was crumbling faster than she realized. The timing couldn't have been worse for her. The local gardening competition was just weeks away, and representatives had begun visiting neighborhoods to scout potential entries. When they arrived at the man's home, they were impressed not only by the beauty of the garden, but also by the resilience it clearly represented. Despite visible damage, the plants had been nurtured back, the pots were neat, and the lights twinkled perfectly against the night sky. Karen, seeing the visitors, rushed to intervene. She insisted the garden was unnatural, claimed it was excessive, and even suggested it violated HOA guidelines. But the representatives weren't there to enforce rules, they were there to admire creativity. To them, her bitterness only highlighted the contrast between the two neighbors. The man knew then that the competition wasn't just about recognition. It was about exposing the truth, about showing everyone that beauty and determination could triumph over pettiness and sabotage. And with the footage he now held, he had the leverage to make sure Karen's actions wouldn't remain hidden much longer. But he also understood patience. Releasing the evidence too soon might dull its impact. Waiting for the right moment, on the other hand, could turn it into a bombshell that no one could ignore. Karen, unaware that her sabotage had been recorded, grew bolder. She scattered birdseed across his lawn, hoping to attract flocks that would tear through the plants. She poured dish soap onto his stone pathway, creating slick spots meant to trip anyone walking across. Each attempt was caught clearly on camera, and each one added to the pile of undeniable proof. As the days passed, the man continued preparing for the competition, working harder than ever to restore what Karen destroyed. His yard became a symbol of perseverance, admired by more and more neighbors. Children stopped to point at the flowers. Couples strolled past just to see the lights at night. The community's affection grew, and with it, Karen's isolation deepened. What Karen didn't realize was that the man was preparing more than his yard. He was preparing a public, unveiling one that would not only showcase his garden, but also reveal the full extent of her sabotage in front of the entire neighborhood and beyond. The stage was nearly set. Karen believed she was still winning small victories in the night, but her downfall was already in motion. And when the truth came out, it would leave her reputation shattered, with no way to recover. The competitionth day of the local gardening competition arrived like a storm building on the horizon. For weeks, the man had poured his energy into perfecting every detail of his yard. The flowers, once trampled and torn, now bloomed brighter than ever. The stone walkways, carefully scrubbed, gleamed in the sunlight. Decorative lights, placed with precision, created an enchanting glow when night fell. His property was no longer just a yard, it was a masterpiece. But more than that, it was a message. Each flower stood as a quiet defiance against Karen's sabotage. Each perfectly aligned row was proof that no matter how many times she tried to destroy his work, he would rebuild it stronger. His garden told a story of resilience, and it was that story the judges were eager to see. The competition drew a crowd. Neighbors came out, some curious, others eager to support. Families strolled down the sidewalks, children pointing at the colorful displays, couples admiring the creativity. The HOA board members lingered in the background, their expressions unreadable, silently calculating how this event might affect their fragile control. And then there was Karen. She stood at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, her eyes narrowed into slits. She had spent weeks watching her neighbor's success grow despite her sabotage, and now she was forced to watch him bask in admiration. Her yard, by comparison, looked plain and unremarkable, neatly trimmed grass, a few shrubs, and little else. She had never cared much for gardening, but in this moment, her neglect was painfully obvious. The judges moved from house to house, clipboards in hand, taking notes. When they arrived at the man's property, their excitement was immediate. They marveled at the variety of flowers, the balance of colors, and the meticulous attention to detail. They lingered longer than they had at any other house, snapping photos and asking questions. Neighbors gathered, listening to the judges praise his work. Smiles spread, nods of approval passed from one person to the next. For the first time in years, the community seemed united not by fear of HOA fines or Karen's constant complaints, but by genuine admiration for one of their own. Karen, unable to contain herself, stormed over. She interrupted the judges, waving her arms dramatically as she launched into a tirade. She claimed the garden was unnatural, that it attracted pests, that it violated HOA regulations. Her voice carried across the crowd, shrill and desperate, but her words fell flat. The judges, focused on beauty and creativity, dismissed her outbursts as irrelevant. The neighbors, however, were less forgiving. Murmurs spread through the crowd. People exchanged knowing glances, rolling their eyes at her antics. Karen had always been overbearing, but the spectacle revealed just how far she was willing to go. For the first time, she wasn't the enforcer of rules, she was the disruptor of peace. The man stood quietly through it all, his expression calm. He didn't need to argue. He didn't need to defend himself. He knew the truth would speak louder than anything Karen could say. And soon, it would be more than just words, it would be undeniable proof. As the judges finished their rounds and the crowd dispersed, whispers of anticipation filled the air. Everyone knew the results would be announced later that evening, and many suspected the man's garden was the clear favorite. That night, the neighborhood gathered again in the community park for the awards ceremony. Tables were set up, lights strung across the trees, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Karen lingered on the sidelines, her face tight with forced composure, while the man stood among his supporters, quietly waiting. When the announcer stepped up to the microphone, the crowd hushed. The winners were revealed one by one, building suspense until finally, the most prestigious award was announced, Yard of the Year. The announcer's voice rang out, clear and triumphant, declaring the man's name. Cheers erupted. Applause filled the air as neighbors congratulated him, some patting his back, others shaking his hand. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment of victory. The man accepted the award with humility, holding it high as a symbol of perseverance against adversity. Karen, however, was unraveling. Her face twisted in fury as she muttered under her breath, her arms shaking with rage. To her, this wasn't just about a garden. It was about power, about control, about her ability to dictate how others lived. And now, in front of the entire neighborhood, she had been exposed as petty, vindictive, and powerless. But the night wasn't over. As the applause died down, the man stepped forward, his expression steady. He thanked the judges, the community, and everyone who had supported him. And then, with deliberate calm, he revealed what had been happening behind the scenes. He described the sabotage, the trampled flowers, the damaged lights, the scratches on the RV. He explained how, week after week, his efforts had been undermined. And then, with the click of a remote, the truth appeared on a large screen the competition organizers had set up for event photos. The footage rolled, grainy at first, but clear enough to recognize Karen, caught on camera in the dead of night, stomping through flower beds, cutting stems with shears, dragging sharp objects along the RV. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers turned into shock, and then silence, heavy and damning, as the reality sank in. Karen stood frozen, her face drained of color. For years, she had thrived on intimidation, on the assumption that no one could prove her wrongdoing. But now, under the glaring lights and in front of the entire community, there was no denying what she had done. The HOA board shifted uncomfortably, their authority crumbling alongside hers. Neighbors stared, some in disbelief, others in quiet satisfaction. The queen of complaints, the self-appointed enforcer, had been dethroned in the most public way imaginable. The man didn't gloat. He didn't shout or mock. He simply let the truth stand on its own, stronger than any accusation Karen could ever make. And as the footage ended, the crowd's silence turned into murmurs, then into applause, not just for the man's victory, but for the justice of seeing Karen exposed at last. Karen fled the event, her retreat as dramatic as her downfall. But the damage was done. Her reputation was shattered, her influence gone, and the community had seen her for who she truly was. Yet even then, the man knew this wasn't the end. People like Karen rarely surrendered quietly, and while she had lost the battle for the garden, the war over the RV and the neighborhood was far from finished. Desperation days after the competition felt like a shift in the neighborhood's very atmosphere. Where once Karen's shadow had loomed over every block and every front yard, now her presence was met with whispers, side glances, and open contempt. The footage of her sabotage spread quickly, not just within the neighborhood, but online, where someone had shared it on a local community forum. The humiliation was no longer confined to her street. It was now public knowledge across the town. For the man, the air was lighter, freer. Neighbors waved to him with genuine warmth. Some stopped by to admire his award-winning garden, others to thank him for standing up to Karen. His RV, parked defiantly near her driveway, became a symbol of resistance. People would walk by and smirk, whispering about how poetic it was that her constant obsession had backfired so spectacularly. But Karen wasn't done. She never was. In her mind, she hadn't lost it. Was the neighborhood that had betrayed her. Every smile exchanged in the street, every friendly nod to the man was, to her, another act of treachery. Her fury simmered, and behind the closed blinds of her windows, she plotted. Her first move came swiftly. She filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, demanding the man's RV be declared a violation once more. She cited obscure clauses buried in the bylaws, twisting interpretations to fit her narrative. But the board, rattled by her public exposure, hesitated. Supporting her now meant aligning with a proven saboteur, and several members were already considering stepping down to avoid further embarrassment. Undeterred, Karen escalated. She began patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard, writing down the smallest of infractions. A trash can left on the curb too long, a lawn not trimmed within her imagined standards, a child's bicycle leaning against a porch. She sent wave after wave of complaints to the HOA, flooding their inboxes with demands for enforcement. But this time, the neighbors fought back. Instead of shrinking under her scrutiny, they banded together. Families compared notes, realizing Karen was targeting nearly everyone. They began forwarding her complaints to each other, laughing at her pettiness. Some even pinned them to bulletin boards in garages and sheds, turning her attempts at intimidation into a shared joke. The HOA board, caught between Karen's relentless badgering and the community's growing frustration, faltered. Meetings turned chaotic, with residents openly questioning why they were paying fees to an organization that enabled harassment. Attendance swelled, not with fearful compliance, but with angry demands for change. Meanwhile, Karen's isolation deepened. Invitations to gatherings stopped. Conversations fell silent when she walked by. Even her closest allies on the board avoided her calls. The queen bee of the block had become a pariah, but desperation breeds recklessness, and Karen wasn't content to let the neighborhood slip away from her grasp. Late at night, she began prowling again, but this time she was cautious, wary of cameras. She lingered near the man's RV, staring at it with barely contained rage. She circled his garden like a predator, searching for weaknesses. More than once, neighbors spotted her lurking in the shadows, and whispers of Karen's stalking again rippled through the community. One night, she made her boldest move yet. Under the cover of darkness, she tried to spray paint the side of the RV with crude words meant to shame and intimidate. But what she didn't realize was that the man had upgraded his security motion-activated lights and new high-definition cameras. The second she raised her hand, the floodlights blazed to life, illuminating her in a harsh, unforgiving glare. The camera caught every detail, the spray can clutched in her fist, the twisted expression on her face, the unmistakable act of vandalism in progress. She froze, exposed once again, and this time, the footage didn't just circulate online, it went directly to the police within days. Karen found herself facing charges for vandalism and harassment. The sight of a patrol car parked outside her home was the final straw for many neighbors. They had tolerated her tyranny for years, but now the law itself had stepped in, and any illusion of authority she held was shattered completely. The HOA board could no longer ignore the storm. Under mounting pressure, they called an emergency meeting to address the chaos. The man didn't even need to attend, his victory was already secure. The residents themselves demanded accountability. They demanded freedom. And above all, they demanded Karen's removal. As the meeting dragged into the night, voices rose. Papers slammed against tables, and tempers flared. The HOA's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, brick by brick, and Karen was at the heart of it. For the man, watching from his porch with the glow of his garden around him, there was no need for gloating. He simply sipped his drink and listened to the faint echoes of shouting from the clubhouse. The neighborhood was finally waking up. Karen's reign of control was ending, and with it, the HOA's stranglehold was beginning to unravel. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew there was still one final act to come. Karen wasn't the type to surrender gracefully, and as much as she had already lost, she was bound to make one last desperate attempt to claw back control. The stage was set for the final confrontation, one that would decide not just the fate of his RV or his garden, but the future of the neighborhood itself. The Collapseth neighborhood had changed. Where once Karen's voice echoed through every street, her power reduced to whispers behind closed curtains. The once untouchable HOA board had fractured, its authority eroding with every meeting that ended in shouting and walkouts. And yet, the end had not fully come, not until Karen made her final move. Her house became a fortress of resentment. Blinds drawn, lights off, lawn neglected. She rarely appeared in daylight, but when she did, her presence was venomous. She hissed insults under her breath at neighbors, sent anonymous letters stuffed with empty threats, and filed frivolous complaints no one took seriously anymore. But deep inside, Karen nursed one last scheme. To her, the true symbol of defiance wasn't the man's award-winning garden, it was his RV, still parked inches from her driveway. Every time she stepped outside, there it was, a gleaming reminder of her failure. She couldn't stand it. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't breathe without seeing it. And so, in her mind, if she could get rid of that, maybe, just maybe, she could claw back some sense of control. One night, she acted. Armed with bolt cutters and determination, she crept across the dark street. Her plan was reckless: to tamper with the RV, to disable it, maybe even have it towed away under false pretenses. She worked quickly, her hands trembling, convinced that if she destroyed the RV, she would destroy the man's victory. But what Karen didn't realize was that the neighborhood wasn't asleep anymore. The man's cameras weren't the only ones watching. Neighbors had installed their own. Tired of her antics, porch lights flicked on as motion sensors caught her creeping silhouette. Curtains shifted as people peered out, phones already dialing. By the time she laid her hands on the RV's locks, The flashing red and blue glow of police lights filled the street. Tires crunched on asphalt, doors slammed, and officers surrounded her before she could even drop the bolt cutters. The neighborhood gathered, drawn by the commotion. Families stood on sidewalks, children clutching their parents' hands, as they watched Karen, the woman who had terrorized them for years, being handcuffed at the edge of the driveway she despised so much. Her protests were shrill, her excuses desperate, but no one believed her anymore. The man watched quietly from his porch, the garden lights casting a soft glow around him. He didn't cheer. He didn't jeer. He simply stood in silence as the woman who had tried to destroy him was finally taken away. Her reign of fear ending not with a bang of authority, but with the click of handcuffs. The fallout was immediate. The HOA board, already fractured, collapsed entirely. Members resigned in waves, unwilling to defend the indefensible. The residents voted to dissolve the HOA altogether, deciding they no longer needed an organization that had done nothing but sow division and give Karen a platform for her tyranny. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. Free from constant letters, free from arbitrary fines, free from the fear of stepping out of line. And it showed. Yards bloomed with individuality, some immaculate, some wild, but all belonging to the people who lived in them. Children played freely on sidewalks. Neighbors held barbecues without worrying about permits or complaints. And the man, he thrived. His garden continued to flourish, a living reminder of resilience. His RV remained parked proudly where it had always been, no longer a source of tension, but a quiet symbol of victory. Neighbors often joked about how it was the most famous RV in town, and even visitors admired the story behind it. As for Karen, her house eventually went up for sale. The for sale sign swayed in the breeze for months, a silent testament to her fall from power. No one missed her when she left. The neighborhood she had once ruled with fear now stood stronger without her. The man often reflected on how it all began with one neighbor's demand to remove an RV. It seemed so small at first, just another petty dispute in a community full of them. But in the end, it became a battle that reshaped the entire neighborhood. Karen's obsession had destroyed her. The HOA's corruption had crumbled under its own weight. And through it all, he had stood firm, not with shouting, not with violence, but with quiet resilience, proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be broken. The garden bloomed, the RV gleamed, the neighborhood thrived. And Karen? She was just a bitter memory, carried away like weeds pulled from a flower bed, leaving only growth in her absence.